Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you to the conference organisers for inviting me here to come and speak to you today. It's absolutely delightful to be here in Cracow. So today I'm going to be speaking a little bit about deliberate fire setting and kind of developments that have happened in this research area in terms of research theory and practice. Now, we do see a lot in the news about sort of suspected arson attacks and deliberate fires that cause a lot of damage and have a large financial implication in terms of property and also sort of damage in terms of human life and injury and also fatalities. There have been quite a lot of fires recently in the news, not only sort of in the sort of general public arena, but also recently a lot in prisons and in sort of psychiatric hospitals as well. There have been several large sort of fires within prisons in the US of recent, which have resulted in a large number of fatalities. So it's a really important area for us to consider in forensic psychology, not only in terms of the treatment and management of people who maybe come into forensic settings with a history of this kind of behaviour, but also in terms of risk management of people maybe setting fires within our institutions as well. So just a short overview of my talk today. I'm going to be talking a lot about how this research area has progressed significantly in recent years. Historically, deliberate fire setting hasn't had a lot of attention paid to it. So I'll start off by kind of talking about our general kind of knowledge and understanding of deliberate fire setting and the developments that have been made in sort of theoretical explanations of this behaviour. Then talk a bit about characteristics of people who set deliberate fires and potential treatment needs, things that we should be targeting in clinical practice with such offenders. And then focusing more on specific developments in terms of assessment and also in terms of psychological interventions with this population. So starting off with kind of our general knowledge and theoretical explanations of fire setting. First of all, it sounds maybe quite silly, but to sort of look at the terminology of what is fire setting. However, a lot of people maybe assume that it is just restricted to arson. However, arson has a specific kind of definition. It's a legal term, and it refers to the intentional destruction of property via fire for unlawful purposes. The problem being is that not all offences which involve fire may attract a conviction of arson, and the definition varies across different legal jurisdictions. So not everybody who maybe has set a deliberate fire necessarily attracts a conviction of arson. So this term kind of neglects a wide range of people in clinical practice that we may meet who have been involved in deliberate fire setting. Another frequently used term is pyromania. Pyromania is a specific disorder under the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. It's still included in version 5. And it refers to a specific sort of diagnostic criteria. However, if you don't meet the exact criteria, and it is very, very specific, or you have set fires for financial gain, so socio-political ideology, to cover up a different kind of offence, for anger, revenge, to improve your living conditions, if you're suffering from delusions at the time of setting the fire, are intoxicated, have dementia, or a learning disability, then you won't meet this diagnosis. So I think it's approximately 3% of people actually are generally found in sort of research samples to have met the diagnostic criteria for pyromania, which leaves quite a large range of people that we might see in clinical practice for deliberate fire setting who would not sort of come under this kind of terminology. So for the purpose of this talk and also for the research that I've been sort of conducting with colleagues at the University of Kent, we use the term fire setting to describe all intentional acts of setting a fire that may or may have not have been legally recorded as arson. So people who maybe have set a fire in the commission of another offence, maybe somebody has killed somebody and then set fire to the body, or has stolen a car and set fire to dispose of that. They might not have attracted a conviction of arson, but have been involved in setting a fire. And also intentional acts of fire setting that might not have been legally recorded at all. This could include things such as sort of setting fire for suicide or deliberate self-harm as well. We see quite a lot of that. This may also include fires set within hospitals or within sort of prison cell fires. Not all of these necessarily attract a conviction of arson. They might be recorded in people's files, but maybe not attract any legal attention. So we use the term fire setting to encompass all of these different acts of fire setting that may occur. Fire setting is really quite a significant international problem. As I sort of mentioned before, it does present a significant problem in terms of property damage, injury, fatality, and a significant cost to the economy. I've just sort of taken some snapshots from the US and the UK kind of pictures on what this looks like for these countries, as we don't really have sort of as firm statistics for other areas of Europe and Australia. But just to give you an idea based on the US and the UK, in the US in 2007 and 2011, there were approximately 282,600 deliberately set fires that were reported to the fire and rescue services. This was attributed to 1,360 casualties, 420 deaths, and cost $1.3 billion in property damage. So quite a significant cost to the sort of society in terms of those kind of casualties and property damage. In 2008, slightly less sort of deliberate fires, but still 53,000. Similar number kind of fire-related deaths, 451. And the estimated cost to the economy at $2.53 billion. So it really does present a kind of a large sort of societal problem. And from personal correspondence with people in Australia, this appears to kind of be mirrored there as well. In terms of reasons for admissions into secure forensic settings, arson is the second highest recorded reason for admission to forensic mental health services in the UK. To approximately 10% of patients in UK and European forensic psychiatric hospitals, researchers found that they have a recorded history of fire setting, be that legally recorded or not legally recorded. So this shows that there are quite a significant proportion of people with a history of fire setting within our kind of psychiatric populations. Looking at kind of general psychiatric samples, sort of figures have been estimated that around 25% of patients may have some sort of lifetime recorded history of deliberate fire setting. So this does kind of give us a kind of a picture here. Adults brought before the courts in England and Wales in 2009 for arson offences was around 1,407. This is approximately 50% of the people brought to the court. So in terms of adult fire setting, it's kind of evenly split, the sort of cases of arson between juveniles, who a lot of people would probably expect to be involved in deliberate fire setting, and also adults. And there are currently 682 people incarcerated for offences of arson in the UK prisons. However, we strongly suspect these figures really do not represent the number of people currently incarcerated for fire or arson-related offences in our kind of forensic populations. This is because arson is a very secretive crime, very, very low rates of conviction, and also, like I said previously, a lot of people may have been charged for a more serious offence such as murder, which maybe involved a fire element, and so that is not necessarily recorded as kind of like their primary offence. So these figures, although they kind of highlight there's quite a significant problem there, I really don't feel they necessarily reflect the full extent of kind of what's going on. So who sets intentional fires? Well, generally the research shows that it's predominantly a male crime, with ratios around 6-to-1. However, females do appear to be overrepresented when we look at psychiatric samples. It kind of goes down to about a 3-to-1 ratio in kind of medium-low secure services to as low as 1.5-to-1 in high secure services. So although it's male perpetrated, research suggests that you might be more likely to find women in psychiatric services with a conviction. When we look at sort of women who have received sort of indeterminate sentences in the UK, 80% who have these indeterminate sentences are in prison for arson offences. So these figures, once again, I don't think necessarily fully reflect necessarily what's going on, because females have generally attracted a lot less attention in the research literature than males who have set fires. It's very kind of sort of male bias literature area. In terms of socio-economic status, people who set fires are generally kind of involved in unskilled employment or unemployed, have low levels of school achievement. They're sort of been found to come from impoverished backgrounds, so sort of neglectful parenting, a history of physical and or sexual abuse, and come from sort of large families with financial hardship. Now, this doesn't look very different to a lot of offending populations, these kind of general characteristics. However, firesetters have generally been found to be quite antisocial, so there may be some differences there. Looking at specific literature that's looked at how firesetters are distinct from other offenders, because like I said, those characteristics I spoke about before don't really make them look a distinct group of offenders, and they haven't really been treated as a distinct group historically. And it's not surprising, as there has been little research into how people who have set fires differ from other groups of offenders. However, we do have some research in this area which suggests that fire setting usually sits amongst a variety of other offences. Quite a lot of property offending, sort of things like criminal damage and acquisitive offending. There is also sometimes a history of violent offending there, so it's very kind of not kind of set on always just setting fires. There seems to be a lot more kind of different types of offending which are sitting with these people. But their offence profile appears a bit different to both property and violent offenders. Research by Hill and colleagues kind of found that firesetters tend to straddle both of the profiles of property and violent offenders. They're not quite like property offenders. They're not quite like violent offenders. They probably leaned slightly more towards an offence profile of a property offender, but weren't quite there. Recent research by Jeff Dickens and colleagues and myself and some colleagues from St Andrews and the University of Kent, we looked at mentally disordered firesetters within secure forensic psychiatric hospitals and compared them to non-fire-setting offenders. And we found that the firesetters differed from non-firesetters on holding an expressed interest in fire or explosives, having a diagnosis of schizophrenia, having a diagnosis of personality disorder, and a history of childhood and family disturbance. In the research that I conducted, a diagnosis of schizophrenia significantly distinguished between those, and having expressed interest in fire solely predicted you being a fire setter. So this seems to be quite a unique kind of characteristic to this group that distinguishes them from other offenders. Also, some recent research by Cracow and colleagues has found that firesetters tend to have higher levels of borderline personality traits in comparison to non-fire-setting offenders. This even included clinical syndromes which were kind of symptomatic of borderline personality traits. So the kind of emotional expression and things like that was kind of very prevalent in this population in comparison to other kinds of offenders. So we do know a little bit about some distinct differences, but not really an awful lot. Things to particularly consider, I think, in terms of how firesetters may be distinct from other offenders is repetitive use of fire, so repeatedly setting fires, not just setting fire maybe as a one-off, and also, like I said, that interest in fire from the research that I conducted really seemed to be a distinguishing factor, a really distinguishing characteristic. So these are some real things to kind of consider when sort of looking at this population. So why do people set fires? Historically, there has been very little attention paid, sort of theoretically, to explaining why people set fires. There has been a lot of research looking at simple typologies, so where people have gone through and classified fire setters, mostly based on motivation, but also by crime scene characteristics as well. And this has kind of been a real kind of prominent thing in the literature. So some common factors for reasons why, through simple typologies, why people say that they might set fires, are things such as revenge, vandalism, excitement, so finding fire intrinsically exciting or fascinating, and less common factors such as setting sort of fire for profit, sort of like insurance fraud, Mental illness has been kind of put there as a motive in itself, so maybe responding to auditory hallucinations, crime concealment, so hiding the commission of another crime, cry for help, and to enhance heroic status. So this is kind of maybe like sort of fire-setting fire officers who maybe set the fire to go in and be seen as the hero, or other people who are wanting to be seen as maybe being sort of a hero for rescuing other people. In this research, revenge has been found as the most common motive of why people set fires, approximately 37%. However, there are some sort of big problems with some of these typologies. A lot of these have been done by simply retrospectively coding file information from sort of prison or hospital files, and no one really reports inter-rater reliability, so it's very, very subjective. So even though these are some common motives that are coming through, it doesn't really offer an objective view of why people set fires, or really overly explain all the reasons why someone might come about to set a fire. Also, motives are complex and multifaceted, so by sort of looking and sort of categorising people by motive into sort of single categories, it takes away from the fact that actually a lot of people may have more than one of these motives. So it's kind of pigeonhole them into a kind of one box, where actually somebody may have a mental illness and be hearing auditory hallucinations and want to set a fire out of revenge for somebody that maybe has angered them. And these kind of typologies kind of take away from that. We move on to simple theories, and probably the earliest kind of theories of fire setting would be Freud's psychoanalytic theory. And in brief, Freud kind of conceptualised fire setting as symbolising repressed sexual urges. So people setting the fires to then want to sort of urinate on them and put them out, or being sexually excited by fires. However, there has been research in Canada and other research which has not found any empirical support for Freud's theory. And even though sexual desires are implicated in very few cases, it does still seem to be the most commonly asked question when doing psychiatric assessments is whether somebody finds fire sexually exciting. So there's no evidence, but we still seem to kind of come back to it quite a lot still. In terms of other simple theories, social learning theory has also been used to try and explain fire setting. And this kind of conceptualises fire setting as a manifestation of reinforcement contingencies and learning through modelling and imitation. So maybe seeing how parents are used fire or manipulate fire. Freeland and Leving talk a lot about people who have set fires having parents involved in fire setting sort of roles, maybe as fire officers or jobs that involve the use of fire, such as like welding, and how their children may see them use fire and then go on to sort of kind of imitate that and use that. There's also the suggestion that firesitters are raised in environments where fire is pervasive, so kind of a lot of rural countryside sort of, locations where people may use fire to dispose of rubbish or to burn out the crops at the end of season. Wolford has suggested that, that this may be sort of a learned way of how to manipulate and use fire. And social learning theory is useful in kind of explaining kind of where fire interest might develop from. So where you might sort of see fire as exciting and interesting because you've attended kind of lots of bonfires and firework night, or all this kind of excitement around fire, and that you might therefore want to go and set fires to kind of replicate that excitement. And it's also quite useful maybe in explaining antisocial fire setting, so maybe growing up in an environment where fire is kind of used very antisocially, growing up in a state where cars are regularly set on fire, and then obviously going on and modelling and replicating that. However, it doesn't explain how a whole host of factors accumulate to produce fire setting. It really is kind of focusing on just the modelling and imitation, and kind of neglects other things that we know in the literature are perhaps other factors that kind of contribute to somebody going and setting fires. Displaced aggression theory is another simple theory that has been used historically to kind of explain fire setting. Some people argue that fire setting is displaced aggression. So I spoke about earlier that revenge is kind of like one of the most common motives of fire setting. People may get angry or want to seek revenge and may set fire to somebody's property rather than directly harming that person, so displacing that aggression onto property. And I said property is a common target for fire setting fire to people's houses, cars. And while this is kind of useful, once again, it only kind of really picks up on one of those kind of motives for fire setting. It only really picks up on those kind of anger and revenge driven. And we know that that's not the only reasons why people set fires. Obviously, those typologies, there's a whole host of different motives. So displaced aggression theory really kind of only hones it down to just kind of focusing on one factor. And it's a bit too simple. Also, firesetters' offence histories are more similar to property offenders than kind of those violent offenders. Yes, I said they have a distinct offence profile where they kind of straddle both, but they kind of lean slightly more towards property offenders. So not kind of really very violent. And also firesetters do not generally tend to displace aggression in other ways. So it's not just displaced aggression happening all the time. So displaced aggression theory, while useful in explaining some of maybe types of fire setting, is not really broad enough to explain all of them. Another kind of simple theory that's been put forward was by Geoffrey Geller in regards to communicative arson. And what Geoffrey Geller suggests is that some people may set fires as an attempt to communicate their feelings of distress or anger or upset, or to get them maybe dissatisfaction, to get themselves moved accommodation, or to get themselves moved wing in the prison, or get themselves moved ward, or set fire to cry for help, to kind of say, you know, I need help and I need taking back into hospital, so to kind of try and change their circumstances. Once again, this covers you know, a range of different types of fire setting, very emotively driven. However, once again, it's very, very simple and doesn't account for a lot of other factors. There have been some multi-factor theories that have been put forward to explain fire setting, and multi-factor theories take into a range, try to produce a comprehensive theory to kind of explain a type of behaviour. And there hasn't been a lot of focus in fire setting. We only have 3, so we haven't got very far in comparison to other types of offending, such as violent or sexual offending. However, Jackson and colleagues have developed probably the most widely used theory, I would say, historically, to explain fire setting, which is this functional analysis theory of recidivistic arson. And what Jackson and colleagues developed, they did a functional analysis of fire setting and basically explained that as an interaction of antecedents and behavioural consequences, and how these may reinforce fire setting to obviously reoccur. And they developed this theory from clinical experience, pre-existing research, and drawing on social learning theory. So obviously a lot better than some of these simple theories that have been previously derived, really drawing on a lot of different areas. The problem with Jackson's theory is that it doesn't really focus on things such as cognition, pre, during, and post-setting the fire, something which in other areas of offending has been found to be quite an important area to focus on in terms of treatment. It also, considering that this was developed from clinical experience within a secure hospital, really neglects the role of mental health and how that might play out in setting a fire. So I like Jackson's theory a lot, and I've talked about it and looked at it in a lot of detail. However, there are some areas it's still kind of missing. Another theory, Feynman and colleagues, which was developed before Jackson's, theory, which is really interesting because Jackson doesn't refer to Feynman's theory of fire setting, and Feynman developed his dynamic behaviour theory. It is very similar to functional analysis theory in terms of looking at the antecedents and behavioural consequences. However, it's not very intuitively represented through this lovely formula. Where these differ, and this formula does basically outline the different range of antecedents and consequences, I assure you, where it differs is that Feynman does stress the impact of cognitions during the fire setting. However, it's not very clinically intuitive trying to work within this theory in terms of its presentation. But also, it was mainly developed for juvenile fire setters and kind of sort of translated into this could be relevant to adult fire setters. So it's relatively untested with an adult population, very similar actually to Jackson's. They haven't ever been validated with populations of adult firesetters, which does sort of pose a problem. So I like the fact that they focus on cognition in Feynman's theory, but once again it also neglects roles of mental health and where that might come in, where people have kind of identified this as a potential motive, you know, in the typology literature. So it has got its flaws again. In terms of recent developments, a new theory has been developed by Teresa Gannon and colleagues called the multi-trajectory theory of adult fire setting. And this was developed because of some of the sort of historical problems we've kind of seen in the literature, either focusing in on sort of one factor, the most simple theories, being too simplistic, and also with the sort of gaps within the multi-factor theories that were previously existing. And Gannon and colleagues, what they did was use a theory knitting approach, which is basically taking the best of what is currently there and other knowledge from the literature and clinical practice, and kind of integrating this together to create a comprehensive overarching theory that draws on all the best bits. And they've created a new framework. So this is the multi-factor theory of adult fire setting in its diagram. And I will sort of talk through this so you can kind of understand where this has come from and how this kind of represents quite a big development for us in terms of theoretical frameworks for fire setting. Gannon and colleagues state that there's a developmental context, things that happen within developmental context, that kind of predispose individuals to developing certain psychological vulnerabilities that put them at risk of fire setting. And these include things such as a negative caregiver environment, so maybe sort of neglectful parenting. It might be sort of neglectful parenting in relation to fire play. There's sort of learning of the manipulation of fire. So this could be positive experience of fire or negative experiences, but how those are reinforced. So it's maybe a child is playing with matches, and their parent sees and says, "Oh, you know, that's okay, that's not a problem," or doesn't really kind of, you know, address that. There's also cultural forces. We know that fire is used differently in different cultures, and some children may have greater opportunities to kind of learn about the manipulation of fire and may be exposed to fire more widely. And also biology and temperament. So this may include kind of sort of developmental disorders, onset maybe in childhood of mental illness, and also kind of in terms of biology, there is kind of research into differences with people who maybe have impulse control disorders to do with chromosomal differences and also with like glucose differences as well. So this takes into account those kind of biological differences that may sort of occur in the developmental context. As I said, these developmental context is said to develop certain psychological vulnerabilities in these individuals, which can include inappropriate fire interest, so being sort of inappropriately interested or fascinated by fire, having real urges to see fire. Also the development of fire scripts, so uses for fire and when you should use it. So some people might develop, for example, a coping script. So when they're sort of struggling, they might set a fire, and they have learnt through sort of reinforcement that setting a fire gets people's attention and they will come and help me. So every time they're struggling to cope, they might reenact that. Also, maybe the development of offence-supportive attitudes. These may be fire setting specific, or they might be attitudes that support offending more generally. So there could be attitudes that support antisocial behaviour, or an entitlement to offend, for example, or attitudes that just, like I said, specifically support setting fires, as in that my fires are kind of controllable, you know, I have a right to set fires. Also, self and emotional regulation issues is another psychological vulnerability that is kind of hypothesised to develop here. This may include issues with regulating extreme emotions such as anger or depression, and also kind of sort of managing kind of impulsiveness as well. And then also communication problems, finally. So people who, in the literature, people who set fires generally seem to have communication problems, and Gannon and colleagues hypothesise that this may develop as part of those psychological vulnerabilities, which mean that people may find it difficult to communicate how they're feeling or their needs, and may see fire setting as a way of doing this. Now, obviously, there's lots of people who may have some or all of these psychological vulnerabilities, and we're not saying that fire setters have all of these psychological vulnerabilities. Some will have some will have others, some will have more than some people, some will have less. However, people can sort of generally live quite well with these psychological vulnerabilities until things maybe start to happen, which we call proximal factors. And these proximal factors are said to kind of reflect and also impact upon the psychological vulnerabilities. So these might include life events, so there might be a significant loss or a trauma that might happen to somebody, something that happens that's quite big. Certain contextual factors, this could be things such as like homelessness, or maybe going into hospital, for example, getting in trouble with the police. Internal affect and cognition, so changes maybe in their experiences of emotions, so experiencing high levels of anger, depression, sort of sadness, and also the biology as well. So there might be changes in different levels in like I said, in glucose and things like that might have an impact, and also the culture within which someone might be living in. They might move to a different culture, for example. And like I said, these proximal factors are said to kind of impact upon some of these pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities, but they may also reflect some of them. So somebody who maybe has self or emotional regulation issues anyway suddenly experiences high levels of anger or depression or something like that, might have problems in regulating that anyway as a consequence of sort of developmental issues, sort of as a child and an adolescence, and this may make things worse and exacerbate them for them. We do have two moderators which similarly impact upon and reflect those psychological vulnerabilities, which are mental health and self-esteem. And what Gannon and colleagues say is that if someone has good mental health and good self-esteem, this will kind of help protect them a little bit from those the impact of those proximal factors on those psychological vulnerabilities that they might have. However, if they have poor mental health and poor self-esteem, this will exacerbate those psychological vulnerabilities and make them worse. When those psychological vulnerabilities are triggered by the moderators and proximal factors, these can tip them over to critical risk factors. And this is at the point where somebody is at a heightened risk of setting a fire, because these have all become so much worse for them. And this can then lead to somebody actually setting a fire. Now, what is nice about Gannon and colleagues' kind of theory, which is a bit different to some of the other theories, is it looks at how people can desist from fire setting. And this is either through kind of identity change, that maybe there's a change in their identity, a change in their life, and that they no longer need to set fires, or they might engage in treatment, which obviously helps them reduce their risk and develop skills to actually cope with some of these psychological vulnerabilities and proximal factors, that they don't use fire setting in the future and ultimately reduces their risk of doing that again. However, they also talk about reinforcement as well. And this is kind of through sort of evaluation of setting their fire, through sort of cognition and sort of the cognition and affect associated with setting that fire. And, some people might have positive or negative reinforcement which encourages them to set a fire again. So they might set the fire and think, because they were struggling, and then they get sort of picked up and taken to hospital because they were sort of struggling with their mental health. And they're like, oh, that worked for me. So next time they're in that situation, they might do that again. Or maybe like negative, so that could be something that they wanted. You might also get negative reinforcement, which can also play into that as well. So this is what the top tier of the MTAF looks like, which kind of explains how someone comes to setting a fire. What Gannon and colleagues also added to their theory is a second tier, which outlines 5 trajectories or 5 different subtypes of fire setter. So it kind of draws on that kind of typology literature to allow sort of clinicians an easy kind of way to look at how firesetting, what type of person they might have in front of them, what type of firesetter they might have. So they have the antisocial trajectory, who generally has offence-supportive attitudes, maybe of general criminality or might be firesetting specific. They might have self-regulation problems and might be generally motivated by vandalism, boredom, crime, concealment, profit, revenge, retribution, all kind of by antisocial kind of motivators. Now, historically, we would have said that people who fall into the antisocial category are probably the least likely people to actually require kind of specialist treatment for firesetting. However, as we've been doing research in the prisons and running the sort of firesetting interventions that I'll go on to speak about a bit later, we've actually found that these people can benefit from specialist treatment. Firesetting might not be the only thing, and they might be doing it in an antisocial way, but they may actually benefit from some of the kind of specialist treatment for firesetting as well. There's also the grievance trajectory. So, as you probably expect, kind of self-regulation problems, problems with managing anger, and when they sort of see a perceived wrong or slight against them. They might have likely risk factors of communication problems, of being unable to express how they're feeling about situations that angered them effectively, and probably have fire scripts for things such as like, fire is a powerful tool to send my message, you've annoyed me, and fire is the best kind of most powerful way I can tell you about this. And so, as you probably expect, potential motivators are most likely to be revenge or retribution. We have the fire interest trajectory, which is people who generally have an inappropriate fire interest or fascination with fire, may have a script that fire is exciting, it relieves boredom. So maybe you have a script for when I'm bored, I set fires. Probably have offence-supportive attitudes that specifically support fire setting. That my fires are small, they're for me, they don't get out of control. And are generally kind of motivated by kind of fire interest, thrill-seeking, stress and boredom. So I see it as relief, as a soothing factor. The fourth trajectory is the emotionally expressive or need for recognition fire setters. And these are kind of two categories kind of merge into one, as we feel they have similar risk factors, although slightly different motivators. So generally, emotionally expressive fire setters tend to have communication problems. They tend to set fire to communicate their distress to others. A lot of females will probably fall into this category, especially maybe people who use fire for self-harm or suicide. They like to have self-regulation problems, so problems kind of managing impulsiveness as well, and managing those emotions. And are likely to set fire for a cry for help, self-harm or suicide. The need for recognition fire setters are slightly different. They are likely to have communication problems. They feel they're not being recognised and unable to kind of voice that. So they potentially have self-regulation problems, so once again difficulties in managing impulsivity and those urges to kind of get that recognition. And this is where you kind of find your kind of heroic status fire setters that I talked about earlier in the typologies literature, and also kind of your firefighters who maybe set fires, for example. And the final trajectory is the multifaceted, which generally some people think is like a lump all together, but actually these are probably your most dangerous fire setters within the kind of sort of tier 2 of the MTAF. These are people who are generally involved in a lot of criminal behaviour and probably have attitudes that kind of endorse offending more generally, but also fire setting as well. So they're likely to use fire setting for a range of different activities in a commission of a range of different offences. So they will have that inappropriate interest in fire or fire scripts, which is probably why they choose to use fire as like their preference. It's like their preferred tool in their toolbox. They're likely to have self-regulation and communication issues, and this is because they're likely to set fires for a whole variety of different reasons. There's a whole variety of different motives that could come under this. So these are the kind of hypothesised 5 subgroups of fire setters within the MTAF in our kind of recent theoretical developments. So this is where the MTAF kind of builds on the previous with the tier 1. It builds on drawing on all those simple theories to kind of and explain fire setting and the literature that already exists, and then draws on the typology literature to kind of give clinicians a guide on the type of people that they might encounter in clinical practice. What is nice about the MTAF and how it improves and has developed theory of explaining fire setting is that it accounts for fire setting in the context of mental health issues, which, like I said previously, other theories have failed to neglect. It also considers fire setting in the context of other antisocial behaviour. It doesn't just generally infer that people are pure fire setters and who are only setting fires, when the literature kind of suggests they're involved in all sorts of other offending behaviour as well. So it kind of takes into account that. It takes into account both distal and proximal factors. There's not so much a heavy reliance on childhood experiences with fire. Is able to account for sort of male and female fire setting, where a lot of the previous literature has really been male-dominated and developed, using kind of knowledge of male fire setting. And also has subtypes and trajectories for a quick reference point for people as well. What's really great is there is some supporting empirical evidence emerging both here in the Netherlands and in Australia in support of the MTAF. People are finding evidence of these 5 trajectories and also finding evidence to support Tier 1 as well. So where the other kind of multi-factor theories by Jackson and Feynman weren't kind of ever investigated empirically, the MTAF is being investigated empirically, and we are having positive evidence emerging. So I feel this really represents a significant development in this area. After we have multi-factor theories, which kind of give you an overarching, kind of comprehensive theory of explaining fire setting, we also have micro-theories. And micro-theories are kind of really focusing on the detail of people why people might set fires. And they detail the sequence of thoughts, feelings, events, and contextual factors leading up to and surrounding a particular type of offence. And it's developed in the form of what we know as an offence chain, to kind of outline the sequence of how somebody comes to commit a certain type of offence. And these have proved highly informative for the tailoring of treatment and developing understanding in other areas of offending. Offence chains have been developed for sort of both sexual and violent offending, and also for kind of things like drink driving and that as well. So really, really kind of useful. And how micro-theories are developed is a very much a qualitative kind of approach to theory development. And semi-structured interviews are conducted with participants, or accounts from participants' records are kind of collected about kind of the period leading up to them committing an offence. This is analysed using a qualitative line-by-line analysis known as grounded theory, kind of really looking in there and kind of seeing what commonalities there are between the different people in the data set, and then developing what we have as a model which kind of outlines that the whole process. And recently, myself and colleagues and my colleague Magli Banu have developed 2 micro-theories for fire setting. The first theory that I developed looked at male and female mentally disordered fire setters, both in prison and in secure hospitals. And then Magli looked at specifically non-mentally disordered imprisoned male fire setters. And we did find a lot of similarities between the two, but we did find some distinct differences as well. What I'm going to do, just for the purpose of today's talk, is focus on the one that I constructed, and then give you sort of kind of information where Magli's one kind of fitted in with that, and any sort of differences there. So the micro-theory that I developed with colleagues has a nice little acronym called the FOCMD. It could be better. However, there are some key points that came out from the development of this model. The FOCMD kind of highlights the importance of the development of fire-related factors in childhood. And we already kind of knew that people's experience with fire setting and the development of fire interest in childhood appeared to be quite important from sort of looking at the social learning theory perspective. However, this kind of highlighted that people not only have positive experiences with fire in childhood that can develop an interest in fire, but they can also have negative experiences with fire, which can kind of impact upon their use of fire and sort of subsequent adult fire setting. So, for example, people may have a negative experience with fire, maybe where they burn themselves or witness someone getting hurt with fire, which then leads to them learning that fire is a powerful way to inflict harm. And then they may go on to set fire as a way of inflicting harm on others, maybe in the act of revenge, for example. Also, mental health, as I said before, has kind of been assumed to be a sort of core reason for people setting a fire. It's been sort of picked out as an individual motivator. However, mental health problems appear to be a moderating factor within this model. What we found was that people who maybe experienced auditory hallucinations telling them to set the fire also had a second kind of sort of primary motive to set the fire as well. Maybe it was they'd already experienced a conflict and were wanting to seek revenge, and the auditory hallucinations kind of encouraged them on. But there was only one person in the whole sample who actually just set the fire purely on the basis of kind of mental health problems. So this kind of supported what the NTAF is kind of saying, is that mental health is a moderating factor on maybe pre-existing psychological vulnerabilities that are already there. It also identified 3 distinct pathways to fire setting. We had fire interest childhood mental health, no fire interest adult mental health, and fire interest adult mental health. And I'm going to go and speak a little bit more about each of these pathways. So the fire interest childhood mental health pathway is basically the sort of defining sort of factors included fire-related factors in childhood. So this meant that people in this category had at least two out of 3 kind of factors related to fire setting in childhood, which could include developing a strong affect towards fire, be that positive or negative, so either being really excited by fire or being quite scared of it, that kind of those negative experiences that I said that could reinforce fire setting later for negative purposes. They also tended to have the onset of their mental illness sort of under 18, so a lot of onset of things such as like depression and some early onset of schizophrenia as well. They tended to engage in explicit planning of their offence, so they may have, for example, gone and taken out all the batteries in the fire alarms. They sort of went and pre-sourced accelerants. And they also, post-setting the fire, felt really positive about the fire, they felt good about it, and generally would stay to watch the fire after setting it. What we found when looking at the characteristics of these people, in comparison to the other pathways, is that they tended to have a higher prevalence of schizophrenia and borderline personality disorder. We also found that females were more likely to follow this pathway than they were the other 2. The females who were in the sample were overrepresented in this pathway. And people were sort of more likely to set multiple fires in this pathway as well, so generally set several. The no interest adult mental health pathway, we found that there were sort of no fire-related factors in childhood. They hadn't engaged in sort of juvenile fire setting, they hadn't developed an interest in fire, or they hadn't developed a kind of a strong affect towards fire, be that positive or negative. Their mental health didn't tend to onset until kind of a year to 2 years proximal to the fire. So they kind of were generally mentally quite well, and then they became unwell, sort of very close to the fire in adulthood, and that kind of seemed to be quite a key factor for these people. Their fire setting was generally quite impulsive. It really wasn't planned at all. If it was planned, it might have been some thoughts or particular actions taken in minutes before setting the fire. They were generally quite ambivalent about the fire. They weren't really didn't feel positive about it, didn't feel bad about it. They're just kind of like, oh well, sort of thing. And they generally did not stay to watch the fire, either because they weren't interested or because they didn't want to get caught for it. The third and final pathway, the fire interest adult mental health pathway, these people tended to have fire-related factors in childhood, so they tended to have, the history of fire setting, strong affect towards fire, or that fire interest that kind of developed early on. So very similar to the first pathway. However, their mental illness didn't tend to onset until adulthood, so they were sort of like their early 20s onwards when they started to experience mental health problems. They had low levels of planning, so that be it explicit or implicit, so whether they actively went and got accelerant, or whether they just sat there for a while just kind of thinking about setting the fire. And they generally watched the fire unless circumstances did not allow. So generally, these were people who set their fire for a suicide purpose, so obviously were going to be there because that was the purpose of setting the fire, or they set the fire for revenge and didn't want to sort of get caught. These people, I really felt, kind of reflected those multifaceted fire setters. They had a high number of previous convictions for both violent and non-violent offences. They'd also set the highest number of fires, so they were kind of using fire a lot, but were really kind of engaged in a lot of other sort of antisocial behaviour. And they had generally had a fairly high prevalence of personality disorder across a whole range of different personality disorders. So these, I felt, within the MTAF were kind of more towards the multifaceted people, and probably the people who maybe present as most problematic for treatment. So in conclusion, in terms of developments of theory, we've made significant progress in recent years with regards to theory development. Obviously, historically, we haven't had a lot kind of going on. We've had very simple theories, but we now have the MTAP, which provides a comprehensive framework to inform assessment and treatment, and also the micro theories to give us more of a kind of intrinsic information on how people might progress to setting a fire, so we can kind of tailor treatment and focus on individual pathways. The theories are still relatively untested, though, so we obviously need to focus on that and getting more data and testing these more. Just going to move on to the characteristics and treatment needs of deliberate fire setters. What do we know about fire setters and their treatment needs? Very little, really. There are no kind of explicit control studies until recently. And Teresa Gannon and Aphrodite Pina did a great literature review on what is out there in fire setting, and kind of came up with 4 kind of hypothesised treatment needs. So we feel that fire setters had fire interest or a fascination in fire as a key treatment area, having excessive interest in fire or fire paraphernalia, having emotional regulation problems, as we sort of spoke about before, event supportive attitudes or thoughts, and sort of problems with social competency. So what from this decided to have a look at was actually having a look at these these hypothesised treatment needs in comparison to non-fire setting offenders. So what we went out was out to sort of male prisons within the UK, and we recruited initially 249 participants. Half of these were non-fire setters and half were fire setters. However, these weren't matched on their number of previous convictions or mental health problems, so we felt they weren't kind of a good comparison. So kind of post-data collection, we matched these and selected a matched subgroup of 68 fire setters and non-fire setting controls. All participants completed a questionnaire battery with measures that tapped into those 4 hypothesised treatment needs. And these are just an idea of kind of the psychometric measures that we used as part of this. I won't go into too much detail. And the key question we were looking at was, do the groups differ on the questionnaires? And what we found was, when we compared them, is that on fire-related measures, so looking at fire interest, identification with fire, fire safety, and normality of fire setting, was that fire setters significantly differed from non-fire setters in all of these measures. So these fire-related factors seem to be unique to our fire setter group. We looked at criminal attitudes and associates, and these didn't seem to differ between the 2 groups of offenders, so maybe something that's not so important. We then went on and looked at our self-esteem, loneliness and assertiveness measures, and we found that fire setters showed significantly lower levels of self-esteem in comparison to our control offenders, so our non-fire setting offenders. However, the groups did not differ on emotional loneliness or assertiveness, so these were less important. We looked at emotional regulation, and we looked at the Novaco anger scale and the sub-measures of cognitive arousal behaviour and regulation in terms of anger, as well as looking at the provocation inventory, locus of control and boredom proneness. And as you can see, we found that cognitive experiences of anger and arousal to anger and anger behaviours, the way anger is expressed, were significantly different for our fire setters in comparison to our controls. They seem to ruminate more, become more aroused by sort of angry, become more angry about certain events, and express and show more behavioural expressions of anger than our non-fire setting offenders, were more easily provoked and showed a more external locus of control. So more like to blame other events on external circumstances. So we found these differences, and we wanted to see, are these just practically or are they also clinically relevant? Are these things that are useful to focus on in treatment? Are they true treatment needs? And what we did was we looked at calculated clinical cut-offs, which basically, when you look at a clinical population, these show when people are more like a fire setter, and when they're below clinical cut-off, they're more like a non-fire setter, more like the general population. And what we found is that identification with fire, serious fire interest, fire safety awareness, self-esteem, the cognitive experience of anger, like rumination and provocation, were clinically significantly different for our fire setters than they were for our non-fire setters. So if you had higher scores on these, you were more likely to be like a fire setter than you were a non-fire setter. So these were kind of like, these seem to be kind of our key areas to focus on in treatment. We are still developing knowledge, and this is really only the first kind of area that we've kind of looked at. There are still other sort of areas, such as impulsivity, that we kind of want to investigate. So, you know, this is kind of real preliminary work. However, these findings do suggest that fire factors, self-esteem, cognitive aspects of anger, and ability to tolerate provocation are especially important in adult fire setting, are things that should generally be looked at or targeted as part of treatment with these offenders. Moving on to the assessment and treatment of deliberate fire setting, at present there are currently no validated risk assessment tools for fire setting, which it proves a real problem for psychologists kind of trying to assess someone's risk of going on and setting fires again in the future. Are they going to desist? Are they going to sort of, you know, is that good behaviour reinforcing going to happen again? And as it's been highlighted in the literature, there's a lack of focus on understanding dynamic risk factors, and we know that there's been very little research on this. There have been some attempts to develop frameworks to investigate sort of risk of fire setting. John Taylor and colleagues, and some colleagues in the Netherlands, have attempted to look at using the HCR20, which is sort of a well sort of validated risk assessment tool for violence, and seeing how that can be used for setting fires, for predicting the risk of setting fires, and how that could be adapted. Colleagues at St Andrews have kind of looked at, they've developed what they call the Safari, which is a way of kind of gathering information into a kind of a meaningful framework to kind of look at future risk. And Quincy and colleagues looked at how they could use the VRAG, another kind of violence risk assessment, and actuarial risk assessment, to see how they could use that to predict fire setting. However, none of these have been empirically tested, so we don't know how effective these are, how good these are at predicting risk. So while we have these kind of sort of preliminary frameworks, we're not sort of confident in their use. And in fact, Quincy and colleagues actually passed kind of quite a big caution, saying, you know, they had actually looked at theirs a little bit, but actually there needs to be a lot more in this area before we can kind of do a full risk assessment using these tools. There's little research examining recidivism, which doesn't help this matter. We have little information to inform the development of risk assessment tools, and any research that has been conducted is mostly descriptive in nature. Most studies that have been conducted are kind of retrospective file reviews, and the prospective studies are very, very rare. There's one exception to this, which was conducted in Canada in the 90s. However, apart from this, it hasn't been replicated, kind of looking at people's kind of risk factors and then following them up sort of more long term. Like I said, there have been retrospective studies comparing one-time and repeat fire setters, and some suggested risk factors for repeat fire setting include being younger, single, having spent more time in corrections, holding an expressed interest in fire or explosives, holding greater levels of psychiatric disturbance, so higher levels of mental health problems, having set your first fire as a child, have early onset of criminal conviction, so having sort of been involved in in trouble with the police, or having a criminal conviction when you're sort of younger, having a higher number of previous fire setting charges, and relationship problems. So the size repeated itself. However, an expressed interest in fire explosives in a piece of research I recently conducted, was found to be people who held an expressed interest in fire and explosives were 15 times more likely to be a repeat fire setter than they were to be a one-time fire setter. So it appears that expressed interest in fire and explosives could be an important risk factor to focus on when kind of conducting assessments in people's need for treatment and also in potentially their risk of setting fires in the future. In terms of treatment, there's no standardised specialist treatment available, even in prisons or hospitals in the UK. Emma Parker and colleagues did a very, very helpful survey of this back in 2007. And unfortunately, I can probably say now that very little has changed since then, 8 years on. There is some kind of in-house treatment happening in psychiatric settings. The high secure hospitals in the UK are very, very good at developing sort of in-house programmes and sort of running these. However, they haven't evaluated the effectiveness of their interventions, and very little treatment or evaluation has really been published at all in the area. So it's really hard to know what works and what is effective with people who set fires. And this appears to be an international problem. We've had correspondence with colleagues in Canada and Australia, and they say exactly the same thing. There's very little out there. There's a new programme that started in Australia, but only 4 people have completed it so far. So once again, we're still not sort of sure on how effective this is, although our colleagues are reporting kind of sort of positive outcomes. However, there have been a couple of published kind of examples of treatment with people who set fires. Swaffer and colleagues wrote a paper describing a 62-group session cognitive behavioural programme for patients in a high-secure forensic psychiatric hospital in the UK. The programme, like I said, run for these 62 sessions and focus on modules on fire danger, coping skills, reflective insight and relapse prevention. And they evaluated this by reporting kind of mid-treatment case studies and reported this as saying there was positive outcomes. However, they didn't do any sort of pre-post treatment kind of psychometrics to kind of show quantitative change in terms of patients' treatment. And they also didn't sort of follow up with a second paper kind of outlining what happened at the end of treatment. We only kind of had these mid-treatment results. So we're not sure exactly how effective the programme really was, unfortunately. Hall in 1995 also described a cognitive behavioural programme which was run at a high secure hospital in the UK and focusing once again on kind of similar sort of treatment areas: dangers of fire, coping strategies, self-awareness, self-esteem and family and related issues. The group was a rolling group and ran for a minimum of 52 group sessions with both male and female patients. They did do psychometric tests pre-post treatment. However, they didn't publish any evaluation data. They just qualitatively explained that there were some positive outcomes there. So once again, it wasn't overly informative in terms of what works with fire setters. Probably the sort of best we've had to date was John Taylor and colleagues, who described a 40-group cognitive behavioural programme with patients in a low-secure forensic learning disability service. They're once again very similar kind of focus on treatment in terms of the modules covered, but they did do psychometric tests pre-post treatment and they published them, which was fantastic. And the outcomes of the programme show there were positive shifts in patients' changes on each of the measures that they used. So this kind of really showed that specialist treatment could be highly useful. The only problem is that with both groups there were very small numbers, so it was really difficult to kind of see if the change was actually kind of really meaningful or if it was just kind of just due to the small levels there. So why has there been such little work generally with fire setters? Like a lack of knowledge regarding risk factors. We haven't really looked at dynamic risk factors in any detail historically. There has been a widespread assumption that fire setters' needs are met by general offending behaviour programmes, such as social skills and problem skills, anger management. If we give them a little bit of each of that, that will kind of sort it out. There's also a lack of understanding of the link between mental health and fire setting. Is this a mental health services issue, or is this a wider issue which should be looked at in prisons? And also, untreated fire setters reoffend at a rate of around 16%, which kind of feels quite low, really. So perhaps we don't need to treat. realistically. Perhaps we can give them these general programmes, and if they're only reoffending at 16%, maybe it's not needed. However, estimations of reoffending really vary wildly. They vary from around 4% to 57% in different studies. And base rates of sexual offending are surprisingly similar. Reoffending rates for sexual offending is about 16.8%. And people, I don't think anyone would say that we shouldn't treat people who have a history of sexual offending, yet Firesetters are reoffending at a similar rate, and we're doing nothing about it. Also, research has found that Firesetters, about 57%, will reoffend with a non-violent offence and 31% with a violent offence. So they're not just going to necessarily reoffend with firesetting, they are likely to reoffend in other ways as well. And a study in New Zealand found that adult firesetters actually requested treatment that focused specifically on their firesetting and the motives that underpin their firesetting. So they really identified themselves as a unique kind of group that needed some sort of specialist treatment. So this led to us at the University of Kent with Teresa Gannon and Lone Lockerbie to thinking about treatment and what we should be kind of focusing on. And this led to the development of 2 new treatment programmes for people who engage in deliberate firesetting. We have the FIP, which was run in the prison service, and the FIP-MO, which has been run in sort of forensic psychiatric services. The programmes have a dual focus. They both kind of follow a similar kind of format, so I'll talk about them both at the same time. And their dual focus is to increase patients' understanding of the factors associated with their firesetting, and also to increase their skills to manage risk and lead a rewarding life. They're skills-based with outer group tasks and ward community in practice, and encourage self-reflection, healthy emotional expression and social expression, and look to generalising skills more widely into patients' kind of lives. There is a referral criteria. People obviously do have to have set a fire, and we do accept deniers. And the group runs for 28 weeks and is underpinned by CBT and the Good Lives model. And so it really promotes kind of a positive look to rehabilitation. It focuses on those 4 kind of hypothesised treatment needs that we examined in that earlier paper with looking at the differences there. And it's hypothesised more treatment needs should indicate higher risk. People who have more of these will probably need more intense treatment. It's inconsistent with kind of the R&R principle. So yes, with the Good Lives approach, it's a twin focus, reducing risk and promoting a meaningful life. And the idea is to formulate people's offending in a manner that's meaningful, but also motivating. So kind of looking at people's strengths and what they can do, rather than what they should avoid to stop them from setting fires in the future. I'm just going to whiz through very quickly the structure of the programme, so I'm aware I'm running over. So the structure of the programme, we have a general group formation, and then focus on the Good Lives model, identifying treatment needs, and developing like an offence chain account of people's offences, looking at sort of where interest in fire comes from and those early experiences of fire and how they may influence somebody's fire setting later on, and helping people deal with coping strategies for dealing with fire interest. There are sessions on fire education and fire safety awareness, which we delivered by external fire officers who come in and deliver these sessions, which I find that group members really kind of enjoy. We look at sort of coping with strong emotions and emotional expression, and how to develop coping strategies for dealing with this. Labelling, expressing emotions, conflict resolution within relationships, and development of kind of social skills. And understanding the development and recognising of offence-supported thinking, and also looking at mental health and how that may affect people's offending. And the whole programme culminates with the development of a traditional risk management plan, and also looking at a Good Lives plan, looking at a better life for the future for the individuals who are taking part. In terms of evaluation, we have evaluated both of the programmes. We evaluated the FIP within South East prisons, and this programme ran for about 18 months in the UK. And it followed a non-controlled quasi-experimental design. And what we did with this is we compared a treatment group, so people who were going through the programme, to an untreated control group. So these are firesetters at other prisons who weren't engaging in our treatment. So our treatment group completed psychometrics pre-treatment, completed the FIP programme for 28 weeks, and then repeated those psychometrics again at time 2, and then again 3 months later at follow-up. Our untreated control group followed exactly the same, but they had a 28-week break in between where they just engaged in any normal treatment that was on their sentence plan. Our biggest question was any improvement between those who completed specialist treatment and those who had treatment as usual. And what we found was that prisoners who completed the FIP made improvements in the areas of serious fire interest, identification with fire and fire safety awareness, anger regulation and a more internalised locus of control, and attitudes supporting violence and antisocial attitudes. So they made these improvements in comparison to the control group, which was really, really positive. We then looked at them again at what was the biggest predictors of kind of making treatment improvements, and people who had at least one improvement of fire factor were 3.45 times more likely to benefit from treatment. We then looked at whether those treatment gains were maintained relative to our comparison group, and this was quite hard because a lot of our comparison group were quite difficult to follow up as they were transferred or released. However, we found that treatment gains were maintained by the treatment group on the fire factors, the sort of emotional regulation and self-regulation, and the offence supportive attitudes sort of 3 months later. So yes, those treatments were maintained 3 months later, so it looks like the treatment is effective, making sort of more longer-term improvements. And we found that people who had set more fires were more likely to show improvements in treatment long-term. We did a similar evaluation for the FITMO, and we are halfway through this, so I won't go too much into the details. We rolled the programme out across 26 low, medium and high secure hospitals across the UK. And I've been doing some preliminary analysis on the initial data of the 34 treatment and 24 controls who we've got completed data for at present. We followed a very similar design to the FIP evaluation. However, we didn't have the follow-up period in place, as this was found to be quite difficult. So we just looked at pre-post treatment change. And what we have found so far with our preliminary data is that patients make significant improvements pre-post treatment in comparison to untreated controls on serious fire interest, fire safety awareness, anger expression, and general self-esteem. So some really positive findings there as well. So in conclusion, specialist treatment appears to be effective in the treatment of Firesetters' key deficits. We are seeing improvements, particularly in those fire factors that research has suggested are quite important in predicting recidivism. And the treatment gains in the FIP were sustained more long-term, and we'd like to replicate that with the FIP-MOs kind of moving forward. CBT does show to be a promising kind of therapeutic approach for fire-setting treatment. And the treatment appears to be most effective for those who have set multiple fires. So these may be the people that we should be prioritising for treatment. In terms of future directions, we're still developing knowledge about deliberate fire setting. This is still in its infancy, so there's a lot more to be done in this area. Firesetters do appear to be a distinct group of offenders, but we need a lot more research into this to look at this more widely, and also to look more widely at distinct sort of potential criminogenic needs. Specialist CBT interventions show more promise. However, we do need more research into the effectiveness of these interventions and look at this on a more larger scale and do sort of randomised controlled trials for this as well. And finally, sort of research into recidivism and the development of risk assessment tools is vital to understand, sort of the reoffending patterns of people who set fires. Thank you. Sorry I ran over.
Dziękuję za tą jakże interesującą prezentację. Jestem pewien, że macie Państwo kilka pytań.
So I ask in English. So you've touched a very interesting topic, and how many of these Firesetters have sexual problems? That's my first question. And the second one, are there any researchers about the Firesetters who suffer from analgesia. It's doesn't feeling pain. Are there any research about it?
There isn't any research about analgesia at present. In terms of sexual problems, like I said before, there has been some research which has looked at people's sexual interest in fire. However, there hasn't been any kind of empirical links found for that. There has been quite a lot of questions about sort of links between fire setting and sexual offending, but once again, there isn't a lot of research out there at the moment. A colleague of mine has written a chapter with his kind of hypotheses and thoughts about it, but nothing's been empirically kind of examined, unfortunately, because it's such a new area.
Okay. Czy są jeszcze jakieś pytania?
Ja chciałem Pani doktor zapytać, czy były jakieś badania prowadzone na temat związku między podpalaniem ognia a wykonywanymi zawodami?
There hasn't been any specific research regarding profession and fire setting. However, there has been kind of people have looked at their occupations when they've been incarcerated, and they're generally sort of unskilled employment or unemployed. So that kind of gives a bit of an indication. However, there are a lot of people who aren't caught for fire setting, and I've got some colleagues who are starting to look at unapprehended fire setters in the community. So we might find actually there are some patterns there with people who aren't caught, but the ones who are caught, all we know is that they're generally sort of in unskilled employment or unemployed generally.
Dobrze. Znajdziemy czas na jeszcze jedno szybkie pytanie, jeżeli się znajdzie.
Moje pytanie jest takie, czy są jakieś cechy osób podpalających się, czy samo uszkodzenia poprzez podpalenie, czy samo podpalenie, czy są jakieś precyzyjniejsze badania na ten temat?
There is some specific research, more kind of in the medical literature about people who attend burns clinics, about people who maybe have set fire to themselves and have then attended for medical treatment. However, it's not something I'm particularly kind of up to speed on, unfortunately, but there is some literature out there, but more in the medical literature.
Dobrze. Wszystkie pozostałe osoby, które mają pytania do Pani doktor, zapraszam w tak zwanym kuluarie. Jeszcze raz bardzo dziękuję za niezwykle interesujący wykład.